Okay, this is 373, week one, part six. Um, so we're gonna start going over Macbeth. There's two things I'm gonna want to do. Oh, the other thing I should have said in the intro, and this is something I say to all my classes. It's sort of an important point that I like to make is when you guys took 101 and in 201 also. Um, I hope you learned. I don't know if you did. I hope you learned that writing is a type of thinking. So the idea is that I don't know how you guys write essays, and I suppose there are people who think out all their thoughts ahead of time and they just write them down. But the way I write is when I'm writing an essay, I'm kind of figuring it out while I'm writing. Um, Writing is a form of thinking. It's thinking, but on paper. Um, that seems I don't know. That's how thinking gets. That's one of the key ways thinking is thinking, but writing is also thinking. But I would argue that movies are a form of thinking. The people making the movies, the directors, thinking. Painting is a form of thinking. Writing music is a form of thinking. Playing music is a form of thinking, thinking about the music that was written. Um, Poems are a type of thinking. Novels are a type of thinking. Shakespeare plays are a type of thinking. So, what I like to do in Macbeth is two things. I'm going to go through quotes from Macbeth and talk about why they're interesting. Um, but one of the two things I want to tell you about are I want to talk about what actors do, what writers and directors and actors do, how something gets from the page to the stage. Um, so I'm going to show you lines, and I'm hoping to be able to link you to some YouTube clips. I'm not sure all the ones that I want are there, but I will see if I can hunt them down and put them into these playlists so you can see other actors sort of delivering these speeches. Um, the other thing I want to talk about with Macbeth is men and women, masculinity. One of the things, Macbeth, most of my students are used to thinking about stories as being essentially escapes from the world, right? You go see a John Wick movie or a Mission Impossible movie or a Fast and the Furious movie, and they allow you to escape from the world. Um, they allow you to escape from the world. And students are often frustrated when they read Shakespeare because they can't escape into it in the same way. Because you have a bad day, you go see a Fast and the Furious movie and you forget about your bad day for 2 hours, and that's nice. Shakespeare doesn't really work like that. But students, because most of the stories my students know are blockbuster movies, and because blockbuster movies provide an escape from the world for 2 hours, my students often expect all art everywhere to provide an escape. And if it doesn't do that, they feel like it's broken. But there are other things that stories can do besides provide an escape. One of the things stories can do is they can think like a philosophy essay, like the kind of thing you read in 101. Um, Shakespeare plays are a form of thinking. And in Macbeth, what Shakespeare is thinking about is masculinity, specifically toxic masculinity, um, and men and women. And so that is the subject matter. So those are the two. So I'm going to go through quotes, and for each quote, I'm probably going to talk a little bit about the performance aspect, how actors decide to do things, but I'm also going to talk a bit about the relationship between men and women. Yeah. Okay. Let's get started on this thing. Just going to jump right in. Right, it's going pretty well. Let's take a look at this. First of all, I want to point out the way Macbeth is introduced in the play. Um, they start off with Macbeth as a soldier. Shakespeare, by the way, has four plays about soldiers at home. He has four plays in which there are great soldiers who are great on the battlefield, and then they go home and they're not so good at home. They have a lot of problems at home. If you're interested, those four plays are Macbeth and Coriolanus, which we are going to be reading this semester, Antony and Cleopatra, and the one that I forgot. Fuck. Othello. Aha, Othello. Those are the four plays about soldiers who are great on the battlefield and bad at home. Macbeth, Coriolanus, Antony and Cleopatra, and Othello. Um, okay, cool. Um, so we're introduced to Macbeth as a soldier. This is how Shakespeare wants us to see him first. There's a whole big fight scene and a battle scene at the beginning, and we hear about. Now, in a movie, they show you the battle. In the play, they do this thing that makes students crazy because they're used to movies and not plays. But in a play, instead of a battle scene, they just have a guy come out and tell you about the battle. And students are like, this is fucking bullshit. They just didn't have the technology to do the battle. But actually, nowadays, you would film a battle scene. You could use a lot of cool CGI. In those days, they would tell you about the battle using poetry. And if you don't give a shit about poetry, then it seems really boring. But if you do give a shit about poetry, it's pretty good. That's the special effect, is the poetry. So just to give you an example of this kind of poetry, Macbeth is introduced. Um, Here's our copy of Macbeth. I'm on page 1. One of the soldiers, the captain, I don't give it, he's just some guy from the battlefield, I don't, it doesn't matter, describes Macbeth. Brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like valor's minion, carved out his passage till he faced the slave, which ne'er shook hands nor bade farewell to him, till he unseamed him from the nave to the chops, and fixed his head upon our battlements. It's a fucking cool line. Disdaining fortune, I mean, he doesn't care about luck. He's just going, he doesn't care if it's likely he'll die. He's going out anyway. Brandished steel, he's got a sword, which smoked with bloody execution. That is one of those little Shakespeare lines. It's poetry, man. Macbeth's sword smoked with bloody execution. This is why I love Shakespeare. That's a fucking cool line. Why is Macbeth's sword smoking with bloody execution? Because this play, by the way, Macbeth was a real person who lived in, Shakespeare wrote this in the year 1600. We are reading this 400 years later. But 400 years before Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, there was a guy named Macbeth, and this is his play about that guy from 400 years earlier. So Shakespeare's 400 years behind us, and Macbeth is 400 years behind Shakespeare. Um, so, and it takes place in Scotland, which is in the north of sort of, it's north of England. Okay. So why is Macbeth's sword, talking about poetry, give you a great example of poetry right in the first day of class. Macbeth's sword smoked with bloody execution. Why? If you've ever been to Scotland, it's cold. It's fucking cold. You'll see that in the movie, which, by the way, the movie is filmed in Scotland, and I've been there, and it fucking looks like that. It's great. Several Shakespeare movies are filmed in Scotland. Several Macbeth movies are filmed in Scotland, and it's amazing because it's like, oh, I know where that is. That's the same mountain from the other movie. Why is his sword smoking with bloody execution? Because it's cold. You know when it's cold and your breath is hot and it comes out of your mouth and you can see your breath in the air because the hot breath hits the cold air and it makes this like smoke thing? Well, if you take a sword when it's real cold outside and you fucking stab somebody in the chest with it, when you pull the sword out of them, it's covered in blood. Blood is hot, which means the sword has smoke curling off of it just because it's the heat of the blood hitting the cold of the air, just like the heat of your breath hits the cold of the air. And so Macbeth's sword is covered in blood, but there's also like heat smoke coming off of it. This is why Shakespeare's the best. It's a fucking rad line. And then he says, again, till he faced the slave. That's just an insulting way to refer to the enemy captain. Doesn't fucking matter who he's fighting. Doesn't matter who's speaking right now. Doesn't matter who they're fighting. The point is Macbeth is a badass. He unseamed him from the nave to the chops. That's a cool image. He unseamed him from the nave to a chops. What's a seam? A seam is that thing that holds two pieces of cloth together. You can see the seam on my t-shirt right there. So to unseam would be to rip that apart. Where is your nave? That's your navel. Where are your chops? It's up here, where you eat. So what did Macbeth do to this guy? He stabbed him like in the groin, basically, and then ripped the sword up into his neck. He unseamed him from here, from his head to his genitals, and ripped him open on the battlefield. Again, in a movie, you'd be like, holy shit, that's a fucking cool thing Macbeth did to that guy, like a John Wick movie. But in Shakespeare, that's a cool way to describe it. He unseamed him from the nave to the chops, and his sword smoked with bloody execution. That's fucking cool. That's fucking cool. But the crucial thing is, this is page 1. So the first thing we know about Macbeth is he is insanely violent. He's not just violent, he's bonkers violent. In fact, the next bit, I don't really have time to talk about this in this video, but I'm going to squeeze it in here. Except they meant to bathe in reeking wounds or memorize another Golgotha, I cannot tell. Meaning, he's like, were they trying to create so much blood they could take a bath in it? And then he says, or memorialize another Golgotha. Golgotha is where Christ was killed. So he's like, I don't know whether these guys wanted to like bathe in blood all day, or if they were trying to recreate the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, but they murdered a lot of fucking people. So this is page one. We haven't even met Macbeth, but 100% of what we know about Macbeth at this point is he is so fucking violent. I mean, obviously, soldiers, they involve killing a lot of people in the battlefield, but Macbeth is killing people in interesting and memorable ways that people are talking about, and that tells you a whole lot about his character. He is violent as fuck. I will see you in the next video.